So today, therapists are a kind of new priesthood. And this priesthood has a Bible. It's the Bible according to Freud. So there are several leading lights of this neo-Freudian movement that now dominates counseling and psychotherapy, psychology, counseling psychology at least, and an alarmingly large amount of psychiatry as well. Those theorists and clinicians would be in order. Judith Herman, who pretty much invented complex trauma, which is the new, much trivialized definition of trauma that has joined PTSD in the psychiatrist's diagnostic manual, the ICD-10. I would argue that's an explicitly feminist model of psychiatry, and as I said, greatly trivializes the trauma diagnosis. We already have a trauma diagnosis. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder. I've argued in previous videos, and we'll do further videos on why we don't need another one, why it's probably political activism that has led this new trauma definition, and is therefore unhelpful. Another leading light in getting that complex trauma definition into modern medicine, effectively, is Besel Van der Kolk, who's also very well known for his book, The Body Keeps the Score, which went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list in 2015 and stayed there for 7 years. So that tells you how popular these essentially Freudian ideas and or activist-led ideas are, or how receptive the public is to them. I would say Bessel van der Kolk is probably the one that makes the most sense, is the most scientific in my view, but still has what are clearly Freudian roots. Then you have the truly wacky therapists and therapy styles like Peter Levine's somatic therapy, which is incredibly obviously Freudian in its formation. So it's the idea that you can achieve catharsis. You need to achieve catharsis for hidden trauma. That's what underlies all of these theories, but some of them, they try to be a little bit more clever and a bit more scientific sounding, and others are just obviously wacky, and Peter Levine's somatic therapy is one of those, I would argue. He wrote a book called Waking the Tiger in the 90s, which argued that trauma can't be brought out of the body using words. It has to be done using the body or a series of strange bodily exercises. So that deserves its own video for the snake oil that it is. And then finally, I would say the most popular of them all, the one who's most well known by the ordinary public, is Gabor Maté and his 2008 book, Hungry Ghosts. That really dominates the trauma, the therapy movement really in general, but specifically the trauma therapy movement. And again, in him, the Freudian, the 19th century Freudian roots of that are absolutely clear and explicit and not changed in any sense, meaningful sense at all. They have not evolved at all. It's pure 19th century, early 20th century Freud. And I'm going to prove it today. So we're going to do a deep dive. So I guess let's frame this as catharsis and the search for hidden trauma. That's what modern psychotherapy essentially is these days. It is absolutely trauma obsessed, and that comes from Freud. So Freud was not really even the first person to attempt to frame adult psychopathology as having its roots in childhood trauma, and that the cure for that would be some kind of catharsis, getting it out. It was always a search for hidden trauma from Freud's mentors forward. And Freud had a mentor called Joseph Breuer, who was a physician. Freud was working under him. And famously, Breuer had a patient called Bertha Pappenheim, who'd been sent to him when her father died. They were working in a mental hospital. But to his credit, that's it. She'd been diagnosed with hysteria, as was very common in those days. Whenever anything was wrong with in terms of mental illness with a woman, especially young women, it would be construed as hysteria. But, her father had died, obviously. So, but to his credit, Brewer sort of took time to talk to her, right? And he noticed that when he did, her symptoms, her hysteria, alleviated significantly. So she even had, I think she coined the term the talking cure. She found it really helpful. She referred to it as the talking cure, but he called it the cathartic method, because he believed that it was the fishing out of the traumatic material, what had happened to her, that provided the beneficial effect. So to all intents and purposes, that was the birth of psychotherapy right there. Now, you could argue, and indeed in the 50s and 60s, psychotherapists and psychologists like Carl Rogers did start to argue that it's probably not the fishing out of the cathartic material that provides the comfort and the improvement in symptoms. It's the therapeutic alliance between the therapist and the client, and the fact that somebody's finally taking them seriously, or validating them, or taking the time to talk to them. So just throw that in as an obvious other potential cause of improvement in symptoms. And indeed, that same factor, you might argue, would be at play in mutual aid support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So that's a parallel explanation right from the start, just to put that in there. So the young Sigmund Freud, was pretty impressed with Brewer's apparent success with Bertha, and he set up in medical practice and started to develop his own version of the cathartic method, which was psychoanalysis. So the classic, obviously most people will have heard of psychoanalysis and have an image in their mind of a patient lying on a couch with a therapist behind them analyzing their dreams, and that effectively is what psychoanalysis was. But the theoretical framework underneath Freud's psychoanalysis was psychosexual. So his theories were psychosexual theories, theories of how the human develops sexually through their different age groups, and how things going wrong in those stages of development can cause adult psychopathology. Now, he literally postulated the idea that all adult psychopathology comes from dysfunction in psychosexual development. And Brewer argued with him and was angry with him for being unbalanced and dogmatic, and told him straight up that it can't possibly be that simple. There are more varied causes of traumatic response, or more varied causes of trauma, right? So they're not all sexual in nature, but Freud disagreed. The two men fell out about it, and this was not the last time that Freud would fall out with weighty, consequential colleagues. The other obvious one would be Carl Jung, who was his mentee. So he was Carl Jung's mentor towards the end of his life, and Carl Jung had a similar experience with Freud's insane dogmatism, refusal to have any dissent. And those two men lost their friendship in the same way. So this is a pattern with Freud. He falls out with people who question his quite batty ideas, and has no time for it. So he's a very, very rigid and dogmatic thinker. So Freud's obsession with repressed sexuality, or sexual dysfunction as the root cause of almost everything, are notorious, and he's been obviously heavily satirized for that for the last century or so. So his first psychosexual theory was seduction theory. So the idea that mild mental health orders, or neuroses as he called them, or even psychosis, serious mental health disorders, come from repressed traumatic memories of infantile sexual abuse. That was the seduction theory in a nutshell. And he gave up on it because he couldn't get a single confirmation he had no evidence for it. He couldn't find any evidence for it at all. So he gave up on that one and developed his sort of equally infamous psychosexual theory of infantile sexuality. So the idea that children experience sexual pleasure through specific or different erogenous zones during distinct stages of psychosexual development, and mental, emotional, behavioral disorders will ensue if you become fixed at any one of those stages of development, or fixated, as he called it. So the first of and this is difficult to listen to, so I'm going to take about 5 minutes to go through it. Stick with me. It's really quite crazy. The first of these is sort of well known. It's the oral stage. So the roughly from birth to 1 year, where all sexual desire, according to Freud, is channeled through the lips and the mouth. So, for example, the act of breastfeeding would be a sensual act, according to Freud. Or put it this way, that the breast becomes the first sexual object of interest. And Freud, being, the crazy guy that he is, he sort of believed that you could have too much of a good thing, right? And that would lead to a sort of cavalier attitude if you had too much too much of the breast, but too little would lead to this kind of low energy simp who's sort of doomed to smoke or bite his nails for the rest of his life, right? Because anything that involves compulsively putting things in your mouth is oral fixation, and is the result of infantile sexual frustration. So the next stage was the anal stage, which is around 2 years old, centered on toilet training and having satisfactory outcomes therefrom. So the dynamic at play here is delayed gratification versus immediate gratification, or to put it in Freudian terms, a battle between the superego and the id. So the child is stuck between his kind of animal instincts on one hand, the id, and the demands of society, parents, and so on the other. So that's the superego. But in plainer language, he's stuck between expectations of where to shit, where not to shit, versus the sort of unmitigated joys of shitting wherever you like. And children who fail to negotiate that balancing act get fixated at the anal stage. So children who have just been allowed to, not properly toilet trained, will become anally will suffer from anal expulsiveness, as Freud called it. There'll be scruffy, disorganized adults, and children who've been improperly toilet trained the other way, you've had to hold it in too long, would suffer from anal retentiveness. So, and become compulsive clean freaks, right? So it's pretty nutty stuff. And he's been heavily satirized for it. The phallic stage, which is one of the things he's been satirized for the most, occurs from 3 to 5 years old. Stick with it. This is the stage in which Freud develops his famous theory of the Oedipal complex. So that's based on the plot of a 2,500-year-old drama by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, which explores themes of incest and sees the tragic protagonist, Oedipus, sort of unwittingly having sex with his mother after killing his father. So Freud used this drama to analogize his theories that children project their sexual feelings onto their parents, basically, and boys develop sexual feelings for their mothers and see their fathers as sexual competitors, thus deducing that they are likely to be castrated by their fathers, and girls, conversely, suffer from penis envy because they also have sexual feelings for their mother, but realize somehow that this can't be gratified without a penis. So they transfer their sexual feelings onto their father instead, right? So that's it. There are 2 other stages, latency period and genital period, but I think you've probably heard enough, right? And we can move on. So obviously consensus amongst research psychologists and academic psychologists, sensible psychologists these days, is that Freud was maybe helpful in helping to develop psychotherapy, and his ideas around the subconscious, the possibility that there are parts of the brain that are not accessible to us, but that still motivate our actions, is incredibly interesting. And I would argue, if you look at the work of some leading philosophers and neuroscientists today, they're still exploring that, right? So the idea of hemispheric differences between right and left brain, for example, is starting to look now, Gilchrist's work is starting to look a little bit like revisiting those mysteries that Freud originally explored, and those are really interesting. But this childhood development stuff around psychosexual development is pretty nutty. But here's the thing: it is alive and well in modern psychotherapy, pure in its purest form. So I'm going to walk you through some of the modern writers who are very, very popular now, in fact, dominant in the field, and show that it is pure Freudian psychosexual theory. Okay, so it kind of starts with the ACE movement, the Adverse Childhood Experience study, which I covered in another video, which was led by Vincent Felitti, an epidemiologist, a doctor. When he asserted that adverse childhood experiences, the ACE study that he conducted, kind of vindicated old psychoanalytic views, e.g., that sex abuse causes addictions. Now, unlike Freud, he does claim to have evidence for that. He interviewed 280 obese clients and claims that a large amount of them suffered sexual abuse. I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, that he's made those interviews available in any way, as you know, understandably. So we just have to take his word for it. Remember, Freud couldn't find any evidence of that, or little evidence. But that's what Felitti said from the beginning in the 90s. He said that essentially sex abuse causes addictions and compulsive disorders like overeating. And he's become the first, really, in a long line of neo-Freudians who now sell millions of books each year and who are a massive influence in the fields of counseling, mental health, and addiction treatment. And they are extrapolating ideas about hidden trauma beyond the bounds of credibility, I would say. And there are a few sort of central tenets of their movement, really, that go something like this. One, childhood trauma is hidden in the unconscious, pure Freud. Two, it's pervasive and causes most of the mental illness and even physical illness that is observed in adults. Three, people have to recognize hidden trauma, their hidden trauma that's been caused by usually parents or society, and before they can be expected to make any meaningful change or any meaningful progress in their psychological therapy. And I would say, four, the idea that this trauma is not only hidden to the mind, but is also somehow trapped in the body, in units. So there are units of trauma somehow stored in the nervous system. And that somehow proceeds from there to cause actual organic disease, So very, very odd theories, but these are absolutely accepted, and they are the establishment of counseling and psychotherapy, at least today. The vast majority of counselors and psychotherapists practicing today will believe this stuff as imparted to them by the likes of Gabor Maté, Peter Levine, Besel Van der Kolk, and Judith Herman. So starting around in the 90s, but then accelerating in the mid-2000s, there were a number of best-selling books. In fact, somewhere between 92, when Judith Herman first started publishing her most well-known works and papers, right through to around 2015 with Besel Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. Peter Levine published Waking the Tiger sometime in the 90s, and Gabor Maté published Hungry Ghost sometime around 2008. I'd say those are the four big tomes or big Bibles of the trauma movement, which is synonymous with counselling and psychotherapy today, I would argue. There is little dissent from the views held in those books. Maté's one is the most obviously Freudian. Maté's and Levine's work is the most obviously unreconstituted, unchanged 19th century Freud, catharsis, search for hidden trauma. So I'm going to prove those links now. So in Hungry Ghosts, I've explained in detail before a sort of biography of Maté. He's a methadone doctor in Vancouver, has had a lot to say about addiction, and has given lots and lots of case studies trying to prove that addiction is caused by childhood trauma, right? So here's a few quotes from Maté's work, mostly Hungry Ghosts, that prove, to my mind, the fact that this is naked psychosexual theory and therefore extremely outmoded. Here goes, says Maté. The research literature is unequivocal. Most hardcore substance abusers come from abusive homes. The majority of my Skid Row patients suffered severe neglect and maltreatment early in life. Well, now, I'm actually going to agree essentially with that. I think that it is true that at the time he was writing, mid-2000s, the majority of Skid Row injection drug users probably did grow up in care homes and things like that. There's a couple of things I'd say about that, though. One, the tent cities of today are not synonymous with the Skid Row of 2008. Michael Schellenberger and other journalists have covered widely the fact that the 10 cities of the western coastal United States and Canada are not populated by people that come mostly by people that come from terribly abusive, poverty-stricken backgrounds. There is a very large amount of middle-class kids from the Midwest who either have mental health problems or who are just on a drug adventure, essentially, and have moved to sunnier climes where the prevailing attitude is much more permissive, and you can have drug parties on the street. So if you trace the family background of a lot of these kids that are hanging around in Tent City, you'll find that it is not anything like 95% brought up in poverty, inequality, abusive homes. Far from it. A lot of them will be from normal middle-class homes, and it's almost been the system really that's failed them and allowed them a space to be completely unravel, right? So these are oftentimes normal kids who've gotten into drugs, and then the system has really failed to pick them up and sort them out. The second thing is that Maté's making the mistake, I would say, of conflating two entirely different things. So while many hardcore substance abusers do, like Skid Row injection drug users, do come from abusive homes, most people from abusive homes aren't hardcore substance abusers on Skid Row, right? So, or to put it another way, while 90% of homeless injection drug users in the 2000s might have had significant childhood trauma, it doesn't necessarily follow that 90% of people with significant trauma wind up as homeless injection drug users, right? So as if to sort of somehow speak to this problem in reasoning, Maté then sort of distinguishes between serious drug addictions, as he calls it, and lesser drug addictions, or even behavioral addictions. So according to Freud, the lesser addictions and behavioral addictions like gambling and so on are not caused by trauma, they're caused by a kind of sub-traumatic level of pain. So, quote, not all addictions are rooted in abuse or trauma, but I do believe they can all be traced to painful experience. A hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors. It is present in the gambler, the internet addict, the compulsive shopper, and the workaholic. So for Maté, then, it seems that trauma drives drug addiction and pain drives behavioral addictions or lesser addictions. But either way, addiction is essentially a self-medication for pain, says Maté. Addictions always originate in pain, whether felt openly or hidden in the unconscious. They are emotional anesthetics. The question is never why the addiction, but why the pain. So over the last decade or so, that last sentence has become a kind of mantra with psychotherapists. Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. It's a kind of neat riposte to any annoying practitioners like myself who are kind of impudent enough to ask why so many addicted people don't seem to have any significant traumas that they can remember, right? So they'll say, oh, it's hidden. It's hidden in the unconscious, which obviously is pure Freud. And I'll say, where? And they'll say, in the unconscious, it's hidden. Where is this trauma? It's hidden. Where's it hidden? In the unconscious. Oh, well, I guess we're out of luck then, because nobody knows anything about the unconscious. So the parallels with Freud are really obvious and explicit, right? And they're not much better explained either. But when it comes to painful experiences, surely a better or more profitable question to ask would be, who hasn't had them? Right? Who hasn't had painful experiences? By this mark, everyone would be an addict. Okay, so it's hopelessly vague. Nevertheless, Maté assures us that fleeing pain is the undeniable cause of addiction. Says Maté, the wondrous power of a drug is to offer the addict protection from pain. So, according to Maté and other leading trauma theorists, it's in our nature to push pain deep into the unconscious as per Freud's century-old model, and drugs help us to do that, right? But underlying this is our kind of innate vulnerability and fragility, according to Maté. Quote, vulnerability is our susceptibility to be wounded. This fragility is part of our nature and cannot be escaped. The best the brain can do is shut down conscious awareness of it when the pain becomes so vast or unbearable that it threatens to overwhelm our capacity to function. So this is what I've always said about the trauma movement, and Maté in particular. It fragilizes people. That's my own made-up word, obviously. It makes fragile the people that come into contact with it, and tells them that the fragility is part of your nature. It doesn't tell them resilience is part of your nature or strength. It tells them, you're naturally weak. And this is, to my mind, not helpful. Psychological helping professionals should be helping people to increase their resilience, not believe more and more in their fragility, right? So it's no wonder that we get traumatized so easily, right? Because we're such vulnerable specimens. So, and childhood trauma inevitably leads to brain damage, right? And things like stress, abuse, and lack of love all produce permanent changes in brain chemistry, they tell us, even in the womb, right? So stress is experienced by the mother can cause a predisposition to addiction, according to Maté and others, in the fetus. And in the early years of life, this only increases, at least it does in rats, according to Maté. Quote, rats separated from their mothers at an early stage of development display permanent disruption of the dopamine incentive motivation system in their midbrains, end quote. So I think in other videos, I did another video on the dopamine deficiency model of addiction. The idea that dopamine is implicated in the formation of addiction is almost certain, right? Nobody's questioning that. I'm certainly not. But asserting that our brain's reward functions are permanently damaged in utero or infancy due to maternal deprivation, as observed in rats, is pushing it a bit. Nevertheless, Maté seems to think that the reason lab rats take cocaine is the same reason we take cocaine. Quote, in another study, rat pups deprived of their mother for only 1 hour a day during their first week of life grew up to be much more eager than their peers to take cocaine, end quote. Well, one should hope that we don't get into the situation where our mothers ever leave us alone when we're young, unless we become the eager denizens of crack houses, right? But according to Maté, it kind of cuts both ways. If our mothers are kind to us, then we'll be more or less inoculated, right, to anything the world could possibly throw at us. Quote, "The licking of a rat pup by the mother in the early hours of life turns on a gene in the brain that helps protect the animal from being overwhelmed by stress, even as an adult. In rats deprived of such grooming, the same gene remains dormant." What? So this is really in the realms of the unbelievable, right? So here, what he's presenting is a silver bullet which protects us from addiction or anything else for that matter, mother's love, right? This is just pure regurgitated Freud. So Jerome Kagan, who was one of the most eminent and one of the most liberal psychologists of the 20th century, debunked this precise idea, which is known as attachment theory. So he debunked attachment theory really neatly with this one quote I'm going to give you. So he said that this theory appeals to people really because it is telling them what they want to hear, namely that if quote, "If a mother is loving and affectionate and consistent in the first year or two of life, then like a vaccine, the child will be protected from things like anxiety and depression for the rest of their lives," end quote. But the reasons why it's a preposterous idea, as he further goes on, are obvious. Quote, "Attachment is a far less popular explanation in 2019 than it was in the 1960s, and in 10 to 15 years it's going to be rare to find anyone defending this theory. It's just dying out slowly. Yes, what happens to you in the first year or two of your life has an effect, but it's tiny. If I take a 1-year-old child who is securely attached and the parents die and that child is adopted by a cruel foster parent, that child is in trouble. Their secure attachment is useless. When you think about it, it's silly that after the first year you could predict with any confidence what this person is going to be like in 20 years. It's a ridiculous idea," end quote. That is the perfect riposte, essentially, to the whole of trauma theory and thus modern psychotherapy, which is based almost entirely these days still on attachment theory. So attachment theory is a kind of perfect example of what's sort of probably more commonly known as the first 3 years movement, the idea that experiences in early life are indelible. This is a Freudian theory, it's outmoded, it's kind of ridiculous, and it's also a bit gross. I mean, can you imagine if this mother's love inoculation theory was actually true? Could any fully developed adult actually be content with the idea that he or she would remain permanently defunct just because their mummy doesn't love them or didn't love them in just the right way? I mean, it's kind of icky, right? But it's very it's very typical of the kind of arguments that are very, very fashionable today, and one wonders why such icky ideas have got so much purchase. So Maté doesn't stop there. This is where it gets really interesting and explicitly, obviously Freudian, right? So says Maté, in human development, he means the Freudian psychosexual model of human development, the ingestion of food has significance far beyond its obvious dietary role. When infants are anxious or upset, they are offered a human or plastic nipple. That's how emotional nourishment and oral feeding or soothing become closely associated in the mind. On the other hand, emotional deprivation will trigger a desire for oral stimulation or eating just as surely as hunger will. The more obese a person is, the more emotionally starved they have been at some crucial period in their life. So that sounds rather like oral fixation, does it not? In fact, it is. It is pure Freudian psychosexual theory. And remember the original hypothesis behind the adverse childhood experiences study, Vincent Felietti's work that I covered in another video, the idea that obese people were comfort eating due to their childhood trauma, and in particular sexual trauma. So it should be fairly clear now then that what we're dealing with here is something akin to a cult of trauma, which is promoting Freud's craziest theories of psychosexual development well into the 21st century. And it's not just binge eating. So Maté also links oral fixation to smoking as well. Quote, "Many people who quit smoking begin to overeat because their craving for oral soothing is no longer eased by their cigarette." Now, we know what the cause of eating too much when you're giving up smoking is. It's the massive dopamine deficit that's caused by the sudden cessation of nicotine. And what fixes that? Carbohydrates. That's why you can't leave the fridge alone when you're giving up smoking. It's got nothing to do with oral fixation. Yeah. So, like Freud's wildest ramblings, all of this kind of invites satire, really. I mean, it's like not seeing your mum for 1 hour a day if you're a rat is 92.5% likely to make you a crackhead. Not having spent enough time on the breast, John took to eating 20 hamburgers a day in his early 30s. Being incredibly orally fixated, Bob could no longer cope in the absence of his nicotine-laced nipple and devoured the entire contents of the fridge. You know, it's risible, right? So while almost funny, it's kind of not funny as well, because the agenda is really easy to see for what it is. It's an attempt by neo-Freudian therapists with kind of utopian social justice oriented ideals to place all the blame for adult psychopathology squarely at the feet of a society that's so oppressive that it even manages to pass through the umbilical cord, right? So in Maté and Levine and Herman's new politically correct version of psychoanalysis, which is essentially what they are, addicts in particular are sort of helpless victims who are doomed by way of stress-induced brain damage before they're even born, right? But this is nothing more than political activism and spin. It's utopian politics posing as medical and psychological care. And there's a lot of danger in allowing activists to mold our views regarding mental health, right? Because they've got an agenda which is not to do with the well-being of the addicts they treat, I would argue, although I'm not saying that they don't care at all. I don't know them as individuals. Obviously, on an individual basis, they may very well care for their clients and patients, but I would argue that the overall effect is not positive because they're pushing their own sort of grievance-based brand of politics, really, and there's no place for politics in healthcare. So Maté's and Levine's and the other theorists' agendas mirror those of Felitti and the original ACE movement in sort of seeking to convince us that social injustice and inequity is the real cause of our problems, right? And our unhappiness, and that nothing can be expected of us because we're traumatized. But even if this were true, and it's not, then surely it would still be the most disempowering philosophy that could possibly be imagined, right? It infers that addicts are victims, and there's a sort of tacit understanding which inevitably follows from that, which is a corollary of that, which is that we cannot be held fully responsible for our actions, right? But what would happen if you actually asked real recovering addicts what the story is? They would, rather than eccentric clinicians, right? They would probably tell you something like, it's we who create our own problems. There are texts, recovery texts that will sort of explain this perfectly, like Narcotics Anonymous. There's a good quote in Narcotics Anonymous, something like, through our inability to accept personal responsibilities, we were actually creating our own problems. So that would be a perfect example of the sort of themes of self-help groups like Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous. There is much more emphasis put on agency, and they will run a mile from anything that looks like it's evading responsibility onto things like parents, society, trauma. So yeah, in a sense, recovering addicts who've worked through lay self-help groups have come to understand that we don't really wield any power at all over society. Furthermore, we've got no business holding it to account when we've been some of its greatest dissemblers, right? So in the final analysis, addiction is almost always, not always, but almost always a self-inflicted evil. That is how we would see it. And the only real exceptions to this are people who are actually suffering from psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia, which are beyond their control, right? Or possibly post-traumatic stress disorder proper, okay? So that is, in a nutshell, my breakdown of the Freudian roots of modern trauma theory, why it is still a search for catharsis, a method of catharsis, with the search being one of looking for hidden trauma, which they almost always find. Right now, I think now I'll do a series of videos on the other leading clinicians, because they all come at it from a slightly different angle. And the next one I will probably do on somatic therapies.